Welcome back to the last and final panel, which will be on the Danish perspective on the Western Balkans and their prospects of EU enlargement. And I'm really, really happy to take it forward. The first speaker will be Christian Axboe Nielsen, who is a historian and also a specialist on the Western Balkans. He's written several books that I really can highly recommend. They're very excited. And he worked as an investigator at the Criminal Tribunal in Hague. So Christian Axboe, I've asked you actually to recap some of the findings from today and what we've heard, because it's been already a long morning, but just to have a recap. And then following this, we'll have Michael Aastrup Jensen from the Liberal Party of Denmark, who's also the foreign spokesperson of the Liberal Party, as well as he's also sitting in the Council of Europe in the Parliamentary Assembly Committee and chairing some of the things there. So, and then afterwards we'll have Morten Messerschmidt, who's in the Danish People's Party and also a spokesperson on the EU questions in the Danish People's Party. And finally, Katarina Ammitzbøll, who's from the Conservative Party and member of the Foreign Policy Committee and the EU committee there. So welcome to you all and thank you for attending. I know it's a turbulent day today, actually, in Danish democracy. So while we're speaking about democracy in the Balkans, there's also interesting things going on in the Danish democracy. But we will keep focused on the West Balkans, and I'll give the word to Christian Axboe Nielsen.
Thank you very much. As Charlotte has said, my role here today is not to come and really give my own contribution, but rather to summarize, not least for the Danish politicians who are now in attendance, some of the morning discussion. I will add a few points of my own. Partly, I would like to start with the question which may perhaps shock or disappoint some of the Balkan participants in the audience here, that I sometimes wonder as a Balkan specialist in Denmark whether there is an interest in the Balkans. There's certainly much public interest, as I can see when I'm out lecturing on the topic and in the Danish media, but it's often difficult to see that the Danish Foreign Ministry or other government instances are actively engaged in this question of EU enlargement in the Balkans. And a recent visit of NGO activists from the Balkans to Denmark, when I met with them towards the end of their visit, they were quite disappointed that it was difficult to kind of get the time of day from Danish politicians on this issue. I would like to start my brief intervention by saying that I thought the best place to start summarizing is Deputy Prime Minister Nikola Dimitrov of North Macedonia, who this morning in his keynote speech said, and I quote, "If we cannot have a European way of life at home, we will all move to a European state where we can have that." And I think that's actually the message that, on a way, I would like to put that on buses that drive around in Denmark, so that Danes realize that what citizens of the Western Balkans are asking for is actually to have the same kind of standard of living, to have the same kind of quote-unquote normal life. Olli Rehn, who was the Finnish commissioner for EU enlargement some time ago, he once said memorably that his goal was to make the Balkans as boring as Scandinavia. I think that's also a quite useful way of looking at it. Or if we go to a phrase which I've often used in the Danish media, and this hails from The Economist, we need to understand in Scandinavia and elsewhere in the EU that if we do not come to the Balkans, that is, if the EU does not expand to the Balkans, then we can be sure that the Balkans will come to us. And I think we're hearing that from the activists, we're hearing that from the academics here, not in a threatening way, and that's, you know, to be sure, but we in Denmark, here in Jutland, where I'm located, we have whole communities of Serbs, Montenegrins, other people from the Balkans who have peacefully, voluntarily come here simply because they have unfortunately given up hope. And I'm talking about not about refugees who came here in the 90s, but much later, who have given up hope but have images through relatives, through the media, of Denmark and other EU countries as beacons of stability. And they, to use an American phrase, they're voting with their feet and coming here if they feel that the EU enlargement will not reach them. So, to also quote my colleague Marko Kmesic, we need to understand that we're in this together. And what we're trying to achieve is not something that's impossible, not something that is a threat, above all, to either the Balkans or to anybody's way of life, but we're trying to create a better and more prosperous Europe. And I'm glad that, and this needs to be said, no speaker today has even for a moment questioned, and I don't think we can question, that this region is inherently part of Europe. All its peoples, all its ethnic groups, all its religions, all its communities are part of Europe, and it's incumbent upon us in the European Union and our politicians to try to make that happen. Now, of course, I think there's also a strong consensus expressed by many speakers, and I can't even mention them all by name, but I think almost every speaker this morning referred to the rule of law, and yet also hit upon the conundrum that we're talking about, on the one hand, bringing the rule of law and better governance, better civil society, etc., to the Balkans at a time when we have several EU members, Poland and Hungary among them, who are not living up to those standards. And I think that's actually the crux of the matter. A lot of it actually, I would say, and this was mentioned by Vedran Djikic and others as well, boils down to the veto issue, which is not an enlargement issue. It has nothing to do with the Balkans per se, but it's an issue of EU institutional reform. And as this week illustrated, this is not just restricted to the very lamentable Bulgarian veto on North Macedonian membership negotiations, but also to the much larger issue of the COVID-19 financial assistance package, which is being blocked by Poland and Hungary. And this kind of thing, I have to stress it, I'm seeing it in Danish social media and I'm hearing it from Danish politicians. Nikola Dimitrov mentioned that he'd lived in the Netherlands. I've heard it in the Dutch media, which I follow as well because I used to live in the Netherlands. We've got a real problem. A lot of people in Denmark, a lot of people in the Netherlands, when they see Poland and Hungary blocking this type of assistance and not being willing to sign up to the fundamental principles of rule of law, then there is a risk that average Danes will say, oh my gosh, why would on earth would we let more countries in like that? What they need to understand is that there are many people, and we've heard from especially the activists, but also other eloquent actors today, who share, I think, the majority view in Denmark that the EU is supposed to be about the rule of law. And in that sense, Danes have allies in the Western Balkans. There are Montenegrins, there are Bosnians, there are North Macedonians, Albanians, etc., who want to achieve the same type of EU that we do here in Denmark. And that's why I'm very glad and very grateful to Charlotte that we also had an excellent panel with the activists. The activists are to a large extent working for the same principles which motivate many NGOs and other actors in Denmark and other EU member states. Yet the fact that these NGOs exist and that many groups and citizens in candidate status have so much in common with average EU citizens is unfortunately often, I have to say, barely visible or invisible in Denmark and in many EU countries. Not many Danes realize how many environmental NGOs there are, for example. I often use the example at the university. There's a great group of people in Banja Luka, one of the largest cities in Bosnia, that have organized a Facebook group that is called Biciklistički kutak Banja Luka. That's like the bicycle corner of Banja Luka. And these people love Denmark. They love Denmark and its bicycling paths. They love Denmark and its clean air. They love the fact that there are Danish ministers who bike to parliament to go to work on bicycles. And yes, Tena prelates, if you're out there, they also like Bowen, which I lamentably have to admit, I'm probably the only Dane who hasn't seen the series. But you know, there are positive images there. There are links there, and more recognition of the fact that these alliances exist is needed to stop the continuing othering of some areas of the Balkans and some peoples of the Balkans by some portions of Western European society, some portions of Denmark included. To quote, at the risk of being extremely anecdotal, I have to quote one of my history students here at Aarhus University who last year went to the Balkans, and he came back, and I know this is a terribly naive phrase, but it's also an important one. I mean, we're talking about a 22-year-old history student who traveled to Albania for his spring break voluntarily, came back and said, Christian, I've spent a week in Tirana and they're just like us. And I think if a lot of more Danes would recognize that what they have in common with the citizens of the Western Balkans, there would be a lot more grassroots pressure in Denmark and other countries, and a lot less susceptibility and vulnerability to what Dimitrov and other speakers today have talked about, the language of fear that is often used in EU capitals with respect to EU enlargement. Just wrapping up, I would say that it's also important that our politicians here in Denmark understand how frustrating it is for citizens of the Balkans when our own leaders from Denmark and other countries do not criticize nationalist rhetoric, hateful rhetoric, and undemocratic behavior by certain regimes, politicians, and leaders in the Balkans. Of course, we have to recognize in Denmark and other EU capitals which governments are in power. We have to recognize elections, and at least if they're free and fair. But it is also incumbent upon our politicians to make sure that our diplomats and other actors also interact with representatives of civil society in these countries. I would like to end with a brief comment about the Bulgarian veto of the North Macedonian membership accession negotiations, because our colleague Ulf Brunbauer from Regensburg, who is an expert on Macedonia and Bulgaria, among other things, memorably in a recent interview about this issue, said that Bulgaria's demand, and I raise this because we are in a virtually Danish forum, that Bulgaria's demand was akin to Denmark torpedoing a trade agreement between the EU and Norway, because Denmark suddenly in 2020 demands that Norwegians recognize that they all speak a dialect of Danish. And I know that we have a politician from the Danish Liberal Party, Venstre, with us today. And I would just close by saying that we had a foreign minister in Denmark in the 1990s from that party, Uffe Ellemann-Jensen, who repeatedly said that he thought it was one of the biggest mistakes that the European community and the European Union made in the 1990s was to not say firmly and solidly no to Greece, and to tell Greece that the non-recognition of Macedonia was completely unacceptable. Again, we have a veto, but I think there we need to ask our politicians, if Bulgaria is going to insist on a veto, what can Denmark, the Netherlands, Ireland, and other countries do to tell the Bulgarians that that is not acceptable and that their blocking membership negotiation accessions is unacceptable? And the last point is, let us remember, and several speakers mentioned this today, that membership negotiations are the beginning of the road. All too many politicians in Denmark and elsewhere seem to think that the moment we start negotiating membership with Albania and North Macedonia, they're in. And we need to make it clear that's not the case. They should get in, but on the correct premises. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian. And this is sort of the beginning. I will pass on the word now to Michael Aastrup, who was also mentioned here in Christian's, and also to say what is the Danish Liberal Party's thinking around you could say the enlargement process and what needs to be done, and how do you see Europe in the future in general in terms of enlargement?
Well, thank you so much, Charlotte. And also just a short comment to Christian. I'm actually also one of the other ones in Denmark who apparently haven't seen Born, because compared to how it is described in the TV series, it's almost boring compared to how it is in real life in Danish Parliament right now. So those things can compare. Just a few short interventions from my side, because I would love to also have Q&As from the participants. It is completely in line with what the Liberal Party stands. We want more EU enlargement, but we want EU enlargement when the countries are ready for it. But with the slamming of the door in the faces, as we actually saw even the current Danish government do in the springtime, was actually a bad thing to do. Because if you tell people you're not ready to even talk about enlargement, to even start the Copenhagen criteria process, it's very unfruitful in our views to how to grow up the democratic sense, how to grow up law and order, and actually also tell all the NGOs, all the activists in the two countries in question that you're not even ready to be part of the European family. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if we are not ready to even open the door just a slight bit, others are. Let's say Russia, for example. Eurasia is something that Russia is all the time trying to say, oh, we need more members. We have an open door policy. And we see it in countries like, for example, just Moldova and others who have been almost lured into the idea of some kind of union with Russia. And my nightmare scenario is that if EU still cannot be ready to start real EU enlargement talks, then others will take their place, for example, Russia. And what is happening right now with Bulgaria, with their veto, is of course not helpful at all. And I am absolutely agreeing with Christian that the Danish government should put all the pressure, whatever they can, on Bulgaria to lift the veto. North Macedonia is a country that actually have been doing everything that we asked them to do, even changing their name. They have been active in foreign wars, fighting besides Danish soldiers, other European countries, and now they're not even ready to start the EU enlargement talks. I'm actually ashamed on behalf of Europe that we're not ready to do that. And Albania, of course, Albania is a country that has problems. Also regarding crime, corruption, and so on. But starting the EU enlargement talks and the Copenhagen criteria is not saying that countries are ready to be part of the European Union tomorrow. That is actually a process so that the country can be ready when they are ready. So we can help them in that regard. And therefore, I believe it is important that we do whatever we can. And Charlotte mentioned that I am actually not just spokesperson on foreign affairs for the Liberal Party. I am actually also involved in the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly, where I am actually chairman of the Monitoring Committee for the moment. And that actually was put in place for countries like, for example, Albania and North Macedonia, that we should help them in gearing up to be more European democratic countries. And I actually believe that the European Union should use an organization like, for example, the Council of Europe and the monitoring possibilities we have to nurture them, to let them grow so that they can be ready to also be part of the European Union family. So that is something we can do. That is something we are ready to do from the Council of Europe side. Now the European Union has to be ready as well. And I believe that the Danish government should also take a firm stand in favor of opening the door just a tiny bit more for helping these two countries getting on the right track. And that is something we'll try to do, because I'm not actually that agreeing with Christian when he says that we're not talking about how we should have more EU enlargement from the Danish politician side. I'm actually also vice chairman of the committee we have on foreign policy, which is the so-called closed door committee. And we have had numerous talks with both the Prime Minister and also the Foreign Minister regarding this. And there has been a lot of members, including myself, that have put pressure on the government to try to be more active in this sense. So we are talking about it. We're not talking about it in the open. We're talking it behind closed door, but we are talking a lot about it. So I think I'll end here, and I'm looking forward for the discussion and the questions. Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you, Michael. I just have a follow-up question because, Denmark was very active in the 90s on the whole and up to 2000 and EU chairmanship, both putting in place the Copenhagen criteria, and having the talks about that, putting in the framework. There was also the enlargement towards the Baltics, and we have today, fantastic neighbors in the Baltic Sea because of this process. Is there any way that you could envision a similar process in which we actually engage actively in a sort of in the same way that we actually did in the 90s in terms of putting in place a more embracing place, which is not just politics and legal requirements, but it's also, you could say, partnering with parties, civil society, society in general in the West Balkans in order to embrace, them as our European neighbors?
Well, absolutely, yes. Of course, the Baltic states have history-wise a very close heart to us in Denmark. But nevertheless, we are very eager to, promote European ideas to countries that need them. And let's be frank, Albania and in some sense North Macedonia needs that helpful guidance. So we should be doing that on every level. Also NGO levels. There's an organization called SILBA that was actually started up when all that happened in the 90s. That should be more helpful. I'm also, now it sounds like a CV from my side, but I'm also vice chairman, as you know, Charlotte, of BiEPAG, because you're also vice chairman of BiEPAG, which is also an NGO that could actually go in and help in that sense. So on an NGO basis, on a government basis, we should all be helpful, because this is so important, because if we do not do that now, other forces will take the power, and that is not helpful in any way for our cause.
Yeah, I just explained that the DIPD is the Danish Institute for Parties and Democracy, in which the Danish parliamentarian parties actually engage in partnerships with parties abroad. So a small commercial here. Thank you, Michael. I'll then give the word to Katarina Ammitzbøll, then, and we'll come back on the Q&A afterwards. So welcome, Katarina. I know that you have a fantastic international CV, but apart from that, you're in the EU committee of the Danish Parliament and in the Foreign Policy Committee as well. So what is the Conservative Party's sort of thinking around the EU enlargement towards the West Balkans and the negotiation processes there?
Well, thank you, Charlotte, and thank you for inviting me to this interesting conference. First of all, we think that what the EU has promised needs to be kept, of course. And I will not also say that, Christian Axboe Nielsen said in the beginning that we are not occupied with Western Balkans. I would say that is definitely not true. I was surely also last year in Berlin and met with a number of parliamentarians, and we also had a big discussion on the enlargement process. Apparently there's been a visit to Denmark by civil society Western Balkans. Well, I have not heard about it, and I'm a EU spokesperson. So maybe also look at where you send your invitations to when you come to Denmark. I think there are several aspects of this. We have the 2+4, and if we look at Northern Macedonia, as Michael also said, they have done a lot. It's like they are all the time ready to go on a running track, and every time they enter the running track, tying their shoes, they said, no, you have to go back and sit and wait. And that, of course, is not satisfying. And Albania will come with Northern Macedonia. So we need to proceed with that discussion. However, I think we should also look at what are the rules of the game. And the rule of law is now, fortunately, getting a lot more attention by the Commission and also here by the member states. And there's just been the latest rule of law report I think that's a very good tool, but that needs to also, of course, apply to Western Balkans. And if we look into corruption, I noted that even last year, also the president of Northern Macedonia, Stevo Pendarovski, said that corruption has increased over the last 15 years and now is a security threat. And of course, people would like the same living standard like us, as Christian said, but who has the responsibility? And of course, corruption is enormous, as it's detrimental to the socioeconomic development. And if you look at numbers, also there was a report by the UN and EU that corruption affects more than 8 out of 10 adults in the Western Balkans. So we are also, of course, aware that there are certain things that need to improve. And there is a responsibility. We can also see that even though that Bulgaria has been member of Europe, the EU for a long time, corruption has continued, and also how it has misused European funds. And now we see the demonstrations in Sofia, where the younger generation want change in government because of corruption. So I think that is a major problem. And we need to look into the criteria, and here we really look into the rule of law. And then there's also how the decision-making process. We have, of course, obviously challenges right now with Poland and Hungary. And if we have more in the same category, Serbia and others, I mean, it is very difficult for Europe. And right now, Europe is surely being tested by the corona, by the COVID-19 helping package. So I think we need to also understand where we all are sitting now and the challenges we have, and we don't want to add more challenges to the EU right now. It's just surely under pressure. But of course, again, I'll repeat, we support what has been decided, and also would look positive to the dialogue and continue the accession process with Northern Macedonia and Albania.
Thank you, Katarina. So in general, you're following the situation closely. You have good meetings with also people from the West Balkans. But how would you see, now we have had the activists and you could say the demand side of democracy in the West Balkans. How should we engage, and you as a politician, should you engage with you could say the civil society in West Balkans, in Montenegro, in Northern Macedonia and Serbia? Is that something you see coming, and is there a need for that?
Yeah, definitely. I think we really need to support civil society. And in one of my previous work lives, we had programs to support capacity building of civil society in Western Balkan, where we can see that it's under pressure, also in Bosnia, Serbia, where we worked. That's something we should support. Also in the context of Europe and also the EU, also in other, not even in non-members, but also in member states. And that is very, very important that we have, you can say, civil society ambassadors who we support, who we empower to go out and have these discussions and to build up a stronger independent media and civil society representation.
And also just to ask, there's also the geopolitical aspects of, and which also the Deputy Minister, Prime Minister mentioned, the geopolitical aspects of not engaging in a sort of a serious enlargement process, that you have, first of all, a China interested in the region, you have a Russia interested, you have a Turkey interested in the region. Do you see dangers in that, that we are not actually, that we do not understand the geopolitical position of the EU and Europe as such, and therefore act too slowly?
Well, yes and no. I think we are surely aware of the challenges, and also the belt strategy that China has, and its investments both in Serbia, Hungary, also the alliance with Russia. But the challenge is, what do we do? Would we be able to cut those ties and have everyone converted towards Western Europe, to our democracy and fundamental values, by saying you come into this club and then you close the back door? I'm not sure it's going to be that easy. It's not an either or, but obviously we need to have an ongoing dialogue, have an openness, and surely not push away. I think that is what we need to make sure. But we need to look into the absorption capacity of the EU, and we are already 26 member states. We have big challenges with Brexit. With Italy can become the next. So we have a lot of countries. It's not so EU is one homogenic club you just come on board with, and then we deal and take care of the issues of in each of the Western Balkan countries. You know, linked into that EU is very diverse, very complex. So it's not that it's just one club you become member of and then you're home safe and we can close the door to the East.
Thank you so much. Now to our last panelist, Morten Messerschmidt. Morten, I know that your take on the issue is a bit different, but please thank you for participating. I know I wasn't sure whether you would make it here, but now you're here. Thank you so much. And I look forward to what you think of what is needed at the moment in terms of the West Balkans.
Well, thank you for the flexibility. Yeah, it's some hectic days here in Danish Parliament, so I apologize in advance for not being there from the very start. Well, my approach on enlargement in general now as an MP and previously, of course, as an MEP, have always been what's the best for the countries now in the Union, rather than focusing on solemnly on West of Europe or the candidate countries. So therefore, my main focus is not entirely on what EU as an institution has made of promises to other countries, but rather what's in our best interest. And obviously, on the one hand, you could argue that it's very much in our interest to promote stability and wealth and democracy and things like that in countries that are neighboring to the Union. On the other hand, it's also, I think, very relevant to have a discussion on the impacts on the Union and its 27 countries now when you do enlarge, because our experience, in particular through 2005 and 2007, have been that it has created not only positive things but also challenges, and that I mean not only in the Western countries, so to speak, of the Union now, but in all countries. I mean, it's evident that that one of the major differences within the Union since 2005, with the big enlargement of the 8 countries in Central Europe, have been that it has introduced a new division of the Union. Previously, we spoke about the horizontal division at the Alps, where you could certainly see that there was a cultural distinction between whether you were from the north and the south, that be on the implementation of laws, that be on the approach to budget and things like that. But since the Eastern enlargement or Central European enlargement in 2005 and 2007, also a vertical division has now been introduced, which has only made the imbalances within the Union bigger. And that, I think, emphasizes one of the topics that is not so often addressed when we talk about enlargements, namely well, two points actually. One, that there is no guarantee for a positive development economically, democratically, bureaucratically, or whatever, just having new members within the Union. Not even the process towards membership might necessarily lead to these positive things. Turkey is the perfect example of that, obviously. That's been a candidate country for so many years and is now driving in a very anti-EU, anti-Western direction. But you also saw with countries that did come in, Bulgaria and Romania in 2007, where actually there was a process while they were candidate countries, leading to less corruption, more efficient economy, market economy, better regulation on free media and things like that. But as soon as they had entered, things began to decline again. So I'd like to drive a stick against the argument that that it should per se be the best way to enhance relations between the present members of the European Union and non-EU countries, just to have this objective of membership. As a matter of fact, I think that in reference of many countries at the now center of Europe, in the eastern part of Europe, it would be much more realistic and thereby also enhancing relations in a better way, simply to say that the distances are too far, the differences are too far for them to ever join the European Union, or at least in a realistic time span to join the European Union. I think many of these countries, say for instance Serbia, Albania, and so, they would be much more satisfied with us being calm and realistic, saying it's not going to happen, and thereby we can build, of course, good relations as from our different perspectives and so. And I think it has lacked of courage to do so. Turkey, I know, is not on the table of this discussion because we're addressing the Balkan countries, but it's also the perfect example of why of where it would have been better. We would have been better off from the start to say that membership is never going to happen. So my approach to this has been that step one, this needs to better the life, the economy and democracy and the well-being of the European Union if we want to pursue with an enlargement. Certainly there are countries of that kind, Iceland, Norway, I would never be against that, but I can't really see any, maybe Macedonia, Northern Macedonia, I don't know, I'm a bit in doubt, but besides that, I'm quite skeptical on any enlargement in Balkan or on the east of Europe, of EU in general, and that being based on our experiences from the past.
Thank you, Morten. But wouldn't you say that you could say that, you know, the EU is getting older, we need you know, a higher workforce, we need integration, and you've just had this big trade agreement in China and with East Asia, the biggest ever. So in terms of, you could say the size of the inner market in EU, we need actually to enlarge, and therefore it is in our best interest to actually increase the market and increase the ability of the EU to actually compete with the other big players.
Well, I'm a major supporter of almost any FTA. I think in my 10 years in the European Parliament, you wouldn't find one FTA that I voted against. I was even one of those voting in favor of the one with America that fall. It was a great disaster, I think. So I love free trade. I love free trade agreements. I just want to argue against the dogma that the only way you can have relations with other countries, commerce-wise or whatever, should be by having a perspective or an ambition of giving them a membership of the European Union. Certainly that would be then limited how many countries we could then engage with in the world, and that would be a shame. So I think we should stop this idea that we can only mutually benefit each other by having this perspective of membership, and simply be clear and say that the European Union as it is now is in great internal difficulties. I mean, we just lost the United Kingdom, and certainly in a few years when Britain has found her feet again, other countries will begin to consider whether being in the European Union is the right option, or to find alternative ways. Remember, that it's not more than 4 years ago that UKIP, Front National, Danish People's Party, and various other parties of the same kind around in all Western Europe became the biggest delegations of their countries in the European Parliament. As soon as Brexit has been settled, that there has been some clarity there, people will begin to look back on Brussels and say, all right, ladies and gentlemen, did you solve any other problems that we were talking about 5 years ago? And they'll be answered with a huge no. And therefore, we have great difficulties making the European Union work, and that should be our main focus. So stop talking about enlargements, make the damn thing work, and then make arrangements with all countries from China to the US to Australia, the Balkans, and whatever, on a bilateral level, on an international regulation, not supranational, like we do in any other normal relations.
I won't open the question on your relationship to the EU in general and the Danish, how Denmark should, because it's a huge question. But I guess it also, would you, you know, if you were to recommend the countries in the West Balkans, whether to go for an EU membership, what would you then recommend them?
Well, I'd probably recommend them to go for it, because that's the vast majority of, well, that's the main line in the parliament and the council and so on. I'm just trying to explain why it's seen from internal perspective. It's really self-destructive for the European Union countries to have that approach. But there are so many things in the European Union which are evidently self-destructive. So if, for instance, Macedonia and other countries in the Balkans really want to be a member of the European Union, I'll strongly advise against it. Don't give up all your sovereignty just to have a small increase in GDP growth. But if they want to go that direction, I'm sure that the EU will be foolish enough to do it.
Thank you. Now we have 50 minutes of Q&A. There's a huge amount of comments and questions, and I'll try to pick one for each of you. So there's here one for Christian from Andre de Munder, who says, very good point by Christian and Michael on the opening of negotiations only being the beginning of the process. So on Bulgaria, this history language saga veto is more painful, as Bulgaria itself is lucky to be in. But what is actually the issue at stake? What is it? Why is Bulgaria, you know, testing this language question, Christian? If you could give us a bit of understanding on this.
Well, I don't want to go into a lot of detail on what is a complicated issue, but I think that I share the view of a number of my colleagues who are Bulgarian analysts that the Bulgarian objection, which has been voiced now, unfortunately, in the form of a veto, it's not a new objection, and one can therefore reasonably ask, why are they wielding it as a veto in 2020? Let's also recall that Bulgaria was the first country to recognize Macedonia when it became independent back in the early 1990s. I think it's very unfortunate and very indicative. Some of the Balkan speakers earlier today warned, Tena as well, warned against us against smoke screens that block us from seeing the real thing. And I think, again, that I share the view of Bulgarian analysts that the Bulgarian veto is indicative and symptomatic of a political crisis in Bulgarian politics that has a lot to do with corruption, clientelism in the current Borisov government. And I think that it is therefore really besides the point to talk about history. And as Mr. Dimitrov said, Deputy Minister Dimitrov, I as a historian have to agree, let's let the historians discuss this and not make some kind of tired historical, linguistic, or cultural disputes the stuff of hostage taking in multilateral organizations.
Thank you. And to Katarina from the Honorary Consul of to Albania, Hans-Georg Nielsen. He asked, lack of knowledge of Danes about the situation in the Western Balkans makes it easy for reluctant politicians to block membership talks. What should be done about it? How can we promote more knowledge about the Western Balkans in Denmark as such?
That's a very good question. And I think he should, sorry to say, but he should start with the Prime Minister. I asked her about 2 months ago, what were her position about the Western Balkans and so on. She doesn't even want to discuss it. I said, oh, that's me. And I don't think there's an interest from government side. So I think try to start there. We are trying to push. I think it's important we start this dialogue in time. that surely people don't know much about Western Balkans, but I think also many in Albania don't know much about Denmark, for example, or other countries. It's vice versa. Public information, try to reach out to the Danish broadcast. They have fortunately now set up a new division to discuss EU issues, and with a new journalist, a new team. I think that is really, really welcome, because we have lacked that in our public service. So maybe that's a way to try to approach them, write in the newspapers and try to put some attention on it. I know it pretty well. My parents live in Albania. I have a brother, my sister-in-law lives in Bulgaria. So by that, I know it pretty well. But it's not normal that we travel and see much of Western Balkans from Denmark. That's true. So there is enormous need for further information.
Great. And then a question to Michael from Dukakin Abduli. What is the Danish perspective towards Kosovo-Serbia negotiations on reaching a legally binding agreement for normalization of relations, mutual recognition? So is that something you have been discussing in the Foreign Policy Committee and the Foreign Policy Council?
No, it isn't actually, but we have been discussing it in the Council of Europe instead, so I can just tell you a bit of perspective on that, because we are quite worried about the negotiations right now. I'm hearing reports that they're not as fruitful as they should be, and that perhaps they will collapse in a matter in the near future. And therefore, it is important that all of us who actually want to stabilize the situation between those two countries, that we do our utmost to try to help them reach an agreement. So the Danish government should actually also be involved in this. We have been active in that region for many years, and therefore we also should have a play in that. So this is actually something I could take with me to the committee of foreign policy affairs and try to get the government more involved in this. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Michael. And then a final question for Morten. Was the 2005 enlargement a mistake? When the EU was through the enlargement process and when it started was that a mistake?
I think it was a mistake in the sense that it was done too rapidly. There were essentially, there were several steps in the enlargement process, in the sense that you have the formal membership in 2005, and then for instance, the enlargement into the free market of labor was postponed until 2009, at least with reference to UK and Denmark, but I should think also other countries. And then still there are, for instance, the euro, which is not entirely implemented in all the countries. And I think it was a mistake in the sense that these periods or these phases should have been prolonged into a longer time, so that you had done it more gradually. For instance, when it comes to, as we've now addressed a couple of times, Bulgaria and Romania, it is a huge problem with the level of corruption there and the lack of reliability in the court systems, given that many Danish or other European countries have invested in these two countries under the assumption that the level of legal protection would be equivalent to what is known in their own countries. And suddenly it emerged to be quite the opposite. So I'm not arguing necessarily that an enlargement as such with these 8 countries, 10 with BNR, were a mistake. But certainly I would say that the way it was conducted has been very, very flawed.
And then maybe sort of a final question to all three of you, which I think is, that we were sort of hosting the development of the Copenhagen criteria in Denmark. We took the lead in this in the foreign policy sense. Do you see, and I'll start with Michael, do you see a role for Denmark in actually maybe saying, okay, what should be the the future criteria? What should be the future framework? There's the conference on the future of Europe. Should we sort of bid into that? Do we have a role? And would you think that the Western Balkan countries should be invited into that discussion of the future of Europe? So Michael first.
Well, thank you for that. And absolutely. So like a Copenhagen criteria 2.0, I think that's a good idea. And we as a government and as a country should actually play a vital role in that. But I must admit, I'm not that optimistic about the Danish current government playing a role in that, because we saw how negative they were against even starting up the accession talks with the two countries. So I don't think it will happen anytime soon, I'm afraid. But we should. I actually think that the two countries, North Macedonia and Albania, should be as involved as possible to show them that we're actually eager to try to get them on track for EU enlargement talks. So absolutely yes.
And Katarina, the question of sort of a Danish role in the future of Europe, and also a version like Copenhagen criteria version 2.0, and the involvement of the Western Balkan countries in the conference of the future of Europe.
To stay the first part about the conference of Europe, how we also in Denmark, I think it's important also we conducted well in Denmark, also include civil society and not just expert meetings at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but we need to have it broadened also to mobilize more engagement by Danes, and think that we are part of the EU, and we also can be part of changing and improving the EU in the way that we desire. We should also be aware of what is at stake, and with the enlargement process. We had a good success with the Baltic states back in the 90s. There Denmark played a leading role, but they also of greater proximity to us. I think the Western Balkans, it's easy here to say, of course we should do it and it's important, but frankly, it's just different. The Western Balkans is not the Baltic states for us. I'm sure, that's much more of interest to Austria and other countries in the neighborhood who will have stronger focus. I don't think we should have high expectations that that's going to be on the top agenda in Denmark, but it's important we are aware of it, that we have discussions, and that when we come to that day when they are being fully accepted, that we also are ready and have information about those countries.
And Morten, final question to you. What is your thinking of, is there a need for a Future of Europe conference? And should we include the states who are eager to become members of the EU?
Well, on the first question, whether there should be a conference on the future of Europe, I don't see what really new it should lead to. After the Dutch and the French had rejected also a reflection, this assumption of having huge international, intercultural, and so on, democratic discussion on what Europe should be. And after that, what they came out with was the Lisbon Treaty, which for 98% of its contents were equivalent to the constitutional treaty. So I don't really give much on these controlled processes. I think we should have more referendums. Simply ask the European population whether they are dying to have more enlargements. And if that's the thing, well, all right, then there is a legitimacy behind the process. It's a fact that these enlargements do impact the union and the everyday life of very many Europeans, those that come into the union, but also those that are already here. So that would be my recommendation. And the other one would be then to have some sort of mechanism deeming the new countries, also old countries, by the way, that do not live up to the implementation criteria of the acquis. When I was in the European Parliament, I was a rapporteur for quite a few times on the implementation of directives in the member states, and there was an appalling difference Of course, the Nordic countries were always the good guys that did like 95% of what they should, and then for the 5% there was some technical reason why they couldn't. But the further south and the further east you went, the greater the problems. And this creates an uneven play field when it comes to the trade between our countries, and that's not acceptable. So in my view, we should have a much stricter regulation against countries that do not implement the directives accordingly.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the panelists. I think it was extremely interesting. We could not, for some reason, not get the Social Democratic spokespersons on board on this issue, and I think we were lucky today. It would not have been possible in any circumstances. But thank you for your participation. I'm going to pass on the word to Florian Bieber from the Balkans in Europe Initiative and advisory group, and for closing remarks. But thank you, and I think it's been very interesting to hear your perspectives.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting.
Yeah.
Thank you, Charlotte, for giving me a chance to wrap up the conversation we've had today. I'll draw out a few key points which I think we've heard, and despite different perspectives from the region, from politicians, from activists, and from Danish politicians, both from government and opposition, there are some common threads and of course some open questions and some disagreements. I think the first one is that the Western Balkans are a courtyard of Europe. In the courtyard of Europe, they're not outside of the European Union. I think this has been always noted, that the European Union encircles the Western Balkans. In that sense, it's not about enlargement. It's in a certain way, as it's often said, about completion, bringing the countries in which are surrounded and whose citizens in many cases hold passports of EU member states, who are closely intertwined in their economies and their lifestyles and in their everyday reality with the European Union. Millions of citizens of the Western Balkans are already EU citizens, and millions more live in the European Union. So this is all a reality. The Western Balkans are deeply integrated to the European Union, and many citizens, in fact, are deeply connected. At the same time, being outside of the European Union is something which is not a pleasant place to be in. And Nikola Dimitrov, not today, but in previous talks, has often said, you don't know how cold it is out there. There is a lack of structures, of friends, of allies, of networks, and also support which you get by joining the European Union, and which Britain is of course discovering now by having left, of how hard it is actually to be outside. So this in a certain way is why many of the citizens do want to join the European Union, and there's still enthusiasm despite this process lasting for a very long time, and sometimes being blocked for reasons which are not merit-based. This is the problem. I think we've said today, the process has been lasting for 20 years plus, with no clear end in sight for the countries of the Western Balkans. Now, some of it is of course based on the problems within the region, but some of it is based on kind of rather frivolous blockages outside. And we've heard and we've talked a lot about the Bulgarian veto today. And of course, it's not the only, not the first, and not the last time a member state will block the membership of a future member for rather frivolous reasons. And this is not just about North Macedonia. It's a wider risk, not just for the Western Balkans, but the credibility of the European Union. If a single member state can hijack an important agenda of the European Union, which is supposed to be merit-based and based on a common position for its own national interest, then of course we will likely to have that in a much more profound way in the future. And of course, for all of us, and I think no matter whether we're talking Danish politicians, activists in the Balkans, and politicians and scholars and observers, we all agree the rule of law is central. Now, you cannot demand the rule of law in the accession process and at the same time say, but you also have to recognize that you don't have your own language, that your history is in fact stolen. You can't do that. If you want to have a process which is based on merits and on criteria, you cannot have it sidetracked by the other things. So I think there should be an agreement that this is not helpful, no matter what your position about many other matters. So to make this process not be never ending, but actually ending, an endpoint being that the countries are in the European Union, but not because they just want to be in the European Union for its own sake. And I think the Deputy Prime Minister Dimitrov said it clearly, it's not for its own sake, it's for the purpose of enshrining, institutionalizing, and bringing about profound changes to a society and a political system which are enduring. And this process thus has to have an end point, not a fixed one, but one which is clearly attainable by the societies in question. So this is really what is needed. And that means that rule of law, as we've talked about, needs to be an important criteria, but one which is measurable, one which is enforced both for progress and regression. And we think we have a lack in both, that sometimes progress is not rewarded and sometimes regression is not penalized. So in that sense, the European Union and its institutions have to be in a certain way more outspoken and have developed and sharpened the tools they already have available. I want to come to the point of skepticism about enlargement, which has come up especially in the last panel. If you look at numbers in the European Union, and Denmark is maybe one of the more skeptical countries when it comes to enlargement, the European Union is divided. Roughly the same number of citizens of the European Union are in favor of enlargement as against it. Now, this does not mean actually that EU citizens are against enlargement. They are largely ambivalent and divided about it. Now, this is in fact very important to note. There's often this rumor or reputation that EU citizens are against enlargement. This is simply not factually true. EU citizens are divided, and the question asked is, are you in favor of countries joining in future years the European Union? The question does not ask when do they join, on what merits they join, and which countries they are. So some people will say, and many will say, that they are against enlargement, they're thinking of Turkey. So for example, in Austria, which is similarly skeptical to Denmark when it comes to enlargement, there's a huge gap between a large rejection of Turkey's EU membership, and we can discuss the reasons, but this is not the topic for today, and the countries of the Western Balkans, where Austrians are a lot more favorable. So in fact, if we break down the numbers from the large people who are skeptical about enlargement to which countries are they skeptical about and under which conditions, then I think we have a different picture. And again, nobody, neither in the region nor in the EU, is seeking it as being beneficial that the countries would join tomorrow. It would hurt the countries, it would hurt the European Union. So nobody, as Christian has also mentioned at the beginning of the last panel, nobody is talking about accession today or tomorrow, but about a process which is merit-based, and if countries fulfill the criteria, they will get in. And that is going to be in quite a number of years. But this prospect has to be clear and incentive-driven. Now, and this brings me to the last point. I think we've had this also in our panels, is that, first of all, this, no matter how good the enlargement process, it can never protect against backsliding later on. And backsliding can occur in any country, not just in the countries which joined after 2004. We've had instances in Italy, we've had instances in Austria, we've had instances in other countries where we've had backsliding in the rule of law and democracy and right-wing destructive populism, which is undermining the principles of rule of law, liberal democracy based on protection of human and minority rights. So this is a challenge for the European Union. It needs to adjust its internal mechanisms, because the assumption that the rule of law and democracy are irreversible and once they're enshrined, they will never go back, has proven to be wrong. But this should not hold up the process of joining other countries, or other countries joining the EU. In fact, we could say if the mechanisms are in place to penalize those who breach the rule of law and democracy in the European Union, it's easier to bring new countries in, because one does not have to take care of every last problem before joining, but one has tools once a country is in to make sure that it remains on track, and the mechanisms to deal with them if they don't. And the last point, I think, is really to kind of conclude saying, you've seen voices from the region, from civil society activists, green activists, democracy activists, who are talking about about pollution, destroying of rivers and dams, about highway building. I mean, these are some of the same struggles which we've been seeing in Western Europe. And these are issues where citizens get engaged, and they're doing it not because they want to join the European Union, but because they want to make their lives better. So the kind of concerns of citizens in everyday life in the Western Balkans are very similar to the ones we're having in the European Union. And in that sense, it's much more important to see them as allies and partners, and that also in thinking about what kind of Europe we want, rather than in people who are, who want to have some money and some resources. And the many West Balkan citizens who have left for Western Europe to Austria as well are not just, great assets to the societies they come in. They often come because they actually want their own countries to be less corrupt, to be more accountable and more democratic. And only when they see that it is not attainable, they make the personal choice of leaving. It's often for the benefit of countries like Austria or Germany or Denmark, and to the detriment of the countries of the Western Balkans. Ideally, I would like them to be able to stay in their countries because they believe that they can make a difference and change their society there. So I think with that common goal, I think we're still a long way off, but I think maybe today's conversation helped us highlight that this is in a certain way a shared goal for all of us. Thank you, Charlotte. And thank you for organizing and hosting us virtually, although of course all of us who are outside of Copenhagen would have been much happier to come to Copenhagen today and share in the wonderful city and the company there.
But thank you, Florian, and thank you to all the panelists. I think no matter what, Zoom gives some fantastic possibilities, and it's fantastic speaking to Northern Macedonia, to Montenegro, to Serbia, to Austria. So we have, you feel that you're a community and that you are sort of in part of Europe in that sense. So also thank you to Zoom for that. I think this discussion has been fantastically fruitful. I think it has somehow put things out, and I hope that we can follow up maybe in a year's time, also in this constellation, and maybe be able to meet physically. But we have recorded everything, and we will be putting it out on YouTube, I guess also on the BiEPAGs and on the European Funds for the Balkans. So thank you, Florian. Thank you, Alexander, also for organizing this with me. And I'm sure that we will follow up and yes, and have a fantastic day. We'll hope that the solution on Bulgaria and Northern Macedonia will go forward, and we'll see it will not be the end of it. So thank you to all of you.